talking today about the global haven industry. We're going to be going into a little background on the history of the topic and look at some of the key pathologies in this industry: transnational crime, kleptocracy and odious finance, pirate banking, which I'll explain. We're not going to say so much about tax dodging or submerging markets. I'm going to leave that up to our distinguished guest. The topic of hacking democracy, we're going to have a whole session on that later in the term. And then have some time, I hope, to talk about what to do about it. The global haven industry is not just about tax havens. It's about all kinds of different pathologies, including crime and kleptocracy. And it's important to understand that this is like the Star Wars bar scene, if you're familiar with that movie, where you see lots of different criminal elements, lots of bad people, different dispositions, different specialties that are sitting around the same facilities, making use of them. In this case, the key facility is weak regulation and anonymity, financial secrecy. Today, we are joined by a distinguished expert panel, including John Christensen, who is the founder of Tax Justice Network, former senior economist at the Isle of New Jersey in the Channel Islands. We'll hear a lot more about that today. But John is an old friend and a terrific expert in this area. Been working on Tax Justice Network since the early 2000s with us all. Khadija Sharife, senior editor at OCCRP, Consortium of National Investigative Journalists. She has been editor for Africa, and now she's more of a global investigator. A lot of seminal work on banks, especially in South Africa. Andreas Frank is joining us from Germany. He's advisor to the EU Parliament on anti-money laundering, former Goldman Sachs advisor, and has a profound reputation, profound experience in this area. He submitted recently, just last week, I think, a document that I put on the readings for this website, for this course, involving a complaint to the EU Commission, which you should all take a look at if you're interested. Darren and Tanya Stock are joining us from Austin, is that right? Or where are you? They are.
Yeah, you got it from Texas.
Texas. Oh, good. That's for steamy Texas. And they are distinguished lead organizers in a very interesting piece of seminal anti-enabler legislation involving some of the biggest banks in the world. They've been working on that for quite some time, and they'll be able to share with us a new strategy for tackling this kind of haven behavior. Finally, David Lighton, CEO of The Outer, named fintech startup, is going to share his expertise with us on fintech and AI and some of the new technologies that are impacting this whole area of anti-money laundering regulation. So that's a distinguished panel. I want to basically get out of the way and let them go at it, but I am going to give you some introductory information about the global haven industry as a little bit of background and foundation. We have two Germans in the audience here, so I thought we'd recognize this spy plane from Germany, coming over for Oktoberfest. Andreas, this is in your territory at the moment. Ralph, the corgi, could not be with us today. Unfortunately, he sends his greeting, and he wants us to be reminded of why global tax havens are a global justice issue. Global haven industry is a global justice issue. Of course, we have Plato recognizing justice as the first virtue of social institutions. Rawls' critique of utilitarianism. You need to do your readings on Rawls to understand where he came from and why he revived interest in the real problems that the world faces. And global justice beyond first world conditions is a problem that we cannot solve without tackling the global haven industry. These are problems that cannot be solved within national borders. But we actually can do something about it. That's the great contribution that people like John Christensen have been making, and journalists as well. This outrageous system for perpetuating injustice. So some basic facts about the rise of the haven industry. This is a relatively new phenomenon in human history, to have a network of international secrecy jurisdictions that spans more than 141 countries today. And it has facilitated all kinds of bad behavior. Globalization of organized crime, kleptocracy, now estimate about 5% of the $17 trillion per year of global government spending is wasted on kleptocrats. It's more important to many developing countries than tax dodging. It's led to the accumulation of more than $20 trillion of offshore wealth from the developing world. And we have the problem of odious debt, debt that's stained by corruption and wasted on corruption and misuse in countries right up to the minute. We've seen cases involving Kenya, Zambia, Sri Lanka. We can talk about those. But this is all a live topic from the standpoint of the developing world, which now is an enormous debt problem. Pirate banking is a subject near and dear to my heart. We've estimated the volume of offshore financial wealth and the amount of tax revenue that's that's associated with that. Most of that wealth is owned by the top 0.1%, wealthy individuals, kleptocrats. It has been facilitated by what we call banks to crime wave, more than 1,500 offenses by the top 22 banks in the world, generated $377 billion in fines during this period. Yet we see case after case of where banks like Credit Suisse, HSBC, UBS, Morgan Stanley, Barclays, JPM are still at it. Evidently, the punishment schemes are not working. And then the other phenomena here are multinational corporate tax dodging. Christian is going to say more about that in a future session, but that's basically associated with the fact that the haven industry has facilitated a race to the bottom, involving transfer of wealth across borders and corporate activity across borders. We also have more than $757 billion now of remittances that are sent across borders. It's 4 times the aggregate foreign aid budget, and yet it's still subject to very high transfer costs. And we can talk about how to remove those costs, but that's associated with the phenomenon of international migration. They're called human capital flight, which is on the cutting edge of the problems that the world faces. And finally, representation without taxation. So the fact that democracy is embattled and is fighting in battle against the financial secrecy industry, with the proliferation of cross-border cash and agents of influence. And the central role in all this, this is a fairly sophisticated kind of activity that we're talking about. It's not something that you grow at home alone. It's got sophisticated banks, law firms, and accounting firms, lobbyists, and captive politicians all engaged. So that's sort of the big picture. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the details of this. I'm going to put this whole presentation online. I don't want to have to go through it in detail, but if you paid attention to the details, you would find out the answer to a lot of interesting questions, like how did Ferdinand Marcos and Bongbong Marcos, the current head of the Philippines, make their money? Where did President Nixon have his offshore accounts? How did President Putin and Trump finance their way to power? And my favorite one is, where did Creedence Clearwater Revival have its offshore accounts in the late 70s? First question we want to start with here briefly is just what exactly do we mean by haven? This is an old story. It goes back a long time. We've had a series of exposés right up to the latest round of Swissgate papers, Panama papers, and so forth. You've probably read about those in the news. It isn't just, as I said, about tax havens. It isn't just about offshore. There's plenty of anonymity available in onshore locations like the United States, the UK, Switzerland, Luxembourg, that we normally associate with first world countries. But it's not beyond our control by any means. There's a lot to be done about it. So the Panama Papers was in 2016. We got these periodic data dumps. This was one of the most important, involving 11 million documents, 214,000 offshore companies. This is just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. One tiny law firm in Panama with maybe 2,000 employees was facilitating financial secrecy for more than 500 banks. When we looked at this, and I was invited to be on a presidential commission by the Iceland government in this period to look at offshore holdings by Iceland, we found that this is a network problem. It isn't just one haven. You can't go compare one haven to another and just look at them as isolated. It's fundamentally a lot of interactions among havens, and that's one of the most disturbing aspects of it. I can say more about that later on. We have a serious network problem in the global economy. This is because, you know, essentially, as I said, the Star Wars analogy applies. The essence of a financial secrecy haven is not only in anonymity, but and low taxation, but also very weak enforcement. And we have enablers who are specialized in making these cross-border connections. We have a law enforcement system that basically finds most banksters who have any significance too big to jail. But ironically, this whole system depends in an odd way on the rule of law, because when they need it, they want to invest in first world countries with secure legal systems. They don't want to be investing in the places the money is mostly coming from. So this is a concrete example. John is the origins of this chart. This is about if you eat bananas, you'll be familiar with, in this case, I believe that the company involved is, well, it's a major banana exporter. So the bananas start out in Ecuador, export price of 20 cents a pound. The Cayman Island subsidiary of this company offers purchasing services to this parent company at 12 cents a pound. The Luxembourg Island subsidiary charged 12 cents a pound for financial services. Ireland charged 6 cents a pound for the use of the brand. Isle of Man got involved with 6 cents a pound for insurance services. The Isle of Jersey charged 6p for management services. Bermuda got involved with 26 cents a pound for the use of the distribution network. And finally, it ended up being imported into the UK at 91 cents a pound. All the taxes had been drained off by these captive companies that were charging transfer prices that had nothing to do with competitive markets. So in that sense, to our libertarian friends, if they're going to come back, the invisible hand is nowhere to be seen. This is not an example to brag about if you were into free markets. This is an example of where 60% of world trade goes through such captive companies. Our standard definitions of corruption, heavily influenced by organizations like Transparency International, which publish regularly these corruption perceptions indices. And if you look closely at this list, you find that most of the best scoring countries are, you know, first world countries. They have nothing to do with corruption. They're the very best in the world. And when you look at the lists that are propagated by organizations like the EU, so-called blacklists for havens, you find that they also point the finger at really relatively tiny players in the world haven system. You know, Guam, Namibia, Palau, St. Kitts, Bahamas. And the gray list, even the gray list doesn't go far beyond those sort of minor players, really. On the other hand, you find the same kind of bias when you look at the World Bank's ratings of government effectiveness. All of the yellow shaded here, insofar as they are rated at all, and many of the havens are not scored for government effectiveness, rank very high on the list of government effectiveness. Singapore, Switzerland, Cayman Islands, Brunei, Ireland. These are all rated by the World Bank as having very effective governments. On the other hand, many of the so-called submerging markets, the poorer countries in the world, they're supposed to believe, we're supposed to believe that they are, really ineffective, probably for reasons of their own, is the implication. The idea that government ineffectiveness is an endogenous property that doesn't have much to do with the outside world. Well, that's the point of view that we are contesting. It's sad to see the World Bank maintaining this perspective after so much good work that we've done trying to educate the world about the haven industry. And Tax Justice Network, John's organization, did some of the finest work in that, in terms of having a different set of metrics for financial secrecy, which pointed the finger at players like Switzerland, the United States, Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Singapore, Luxembourg, and so forth, as being among the worst offenders in terms of having financial secrecy for sale. So they are, in contrast to the EU blacklist, they're not anywhere on the list, and nor are any of the European havens like Malta, Cyprus, Ireland, Luxembourg, Netherlands. So what we're doing here is an exercise in what I call investigative economics. We can talk more about that later, but basically we are looking closely at puzzles that are generated by the data. We're not looking so much at high theory. The models tell us where to look. We're deriving the models from the puzzles. We're actually looking at getting up out of the armchair and going out to the field, which is what every one of the people on this call have done. The other basic principle we have, if you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. We try to estimate the size, the metrics for what we're looking at, so we can get serious about arguments about how big problems are. Well, I've written a lot about this. I won't go through all that. My first article about this stuff was in 1976, and I pointed out that the United States had far more $100 bills in circulation than you could account for on the basis of ordinary spending by regular folks. This problem only increased. We now have more than $2.5 trillion of big bills in circulation. Most of that money turns out to be outside of the country. And I made a simple proposal back in 1976 when I was a graduate student, that we recall the big bills and we give people 30 days to turn them in, and we'll see what turns up. Well, that was ultimately adopted, ultimately by 2014, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers signed up for that idea. But by then we already had, much larger volumes of anonymous cash in circulation. And indeed, the EU had signed up for 200 euro notes and 500 euro notes when they introduced new currencies in the year 2000. So this initial idea that we had a money laundering problem as a principal source of the demand for cash was an idea that's been around a long time, since the 70s. We just did nothing about it. That was the case of the European note. Looking at the Spain's 500 euro note that they introduced, we found that about 27% of all those notes came from one place, the Bank of Spain. It was facilitating drug trafficking because Spain was a major importer of drugs from Latin America. My first kind of mentors in this area were people like David Dirk, who's Serpico's partner, um, Robert Levinson, who was a well-known cantankerous FBI agent who disappeared in Iran in 2007. They introduced me to this topic of the global haven industry way back in the 80s. The first investigation was of a bank called the Castle Bank and Trust. And we found in that case that some of the most prominent people in the United States at that point had set up illegal offshore trusts in Nassau in a bank called Castle Bank and Trust. Included the Pritzker family in Chicago, included much of the Chicago mafia. It included Bob Guccione from Penthouse magazine. You probably don't know that name, but there's a long list of illustrious people. And it also included, I just learned last fall, President Nixon, who had an offshore account at the Castle Bank and Trust. I talked for years to the treasurer of the bank to have him confirm that Nixon had this account. And only last October, at the age of 88, virtually on his deathbed, with the treasurer confirmed what had happened. That's why Nixon actually called in Donald Alexander and had this investigation shot down in 1974, just before he resigned. Well, that was an initial offshore bank that was set up by wealthy Americans and opened my eyes to this whole phenomenon. But the phenomenon really escalated in the 1970s and 80s with the growth of lending to Latin America and to Africa by first world banks. The other basic shock that came to my system was in 1986 when I went to Panama to investigate a case involving a guy named Hugo Spadafora. And Hugo had made the mistake of taking on General Noriega, who was sending about 1 ton per month cocaine up the middle to Miami International Airport on an airline, Inair airline, that he owned with Colombia, Ricardo Villani. Hugo had the unfortunate ending, which he assumed that the US DEA in San Jose, Costa Rica would want to know all this. And he arranged to go to San Jose from Panama City. Unfortunately, someone in the room tipped off General Noriega. We now know who that was. It was a US senior official, because the United States had cultivated Noriega as a client. And basically, the intelligence agencies at that point were looking the other way at all this drug traffic that was going on directly into Miami Airport. And when Hugo crossed the border, going back into Panama after having had meetings in Senate, saying he was brutally murdered. And I went to Panama in 1987, and at that point, while Noriega was still in power, investigated his case. Ultimately, the evidence that I submitted, including a complete list of all of Noriega's phone calls for 3 years, was used in the trial in April 1992, saw his conviction. But everyone else in the case basically got off, and none of the US officials who were involved in facilitating all this got off. So that was an eye-opener episode. Well, we've seen the effects of the US anti-drug policy. Basically, they were just the opposite of what you would have liked. Real average cocaine prices in this whole period of increased drug enforcement actually declined because the government had the schizophrenic policy of admitting cocaine to the United States by way of Noriega and other players. There's a whole big investigation of all that. It's associated with San Jose Mercury, but it's definitely another full chapter in this story of organized crime and the role of global industry. The story of kleptocracy, is a long one. I won't go through all of the illustrations. I invite you to look at the story, but I've investigated kleptocrats in dozens of countries here, and here's some of them I tracked down. Odious debt investigations, which are trying to figure out where the money is loaned to these countries. Over and over again, you see similar patterns. This is important partly because so-called kleptocracies are growing as a share of world GDP. And these are countries that are subject to the kind of capital flight and pirate banking that we've been talking about. The reality is that kleptocracy is not just a product of corrupt individuals or endogenous culture. We need to have global cooperation to shut down on it, especially shut it down, and to see that enablers play a key role in this. There are no successful examples of economic development without strong states that can get a hold of this phenomenon. Originally, I was interested in the question of why is it that we have loaned all this money, more money than ever before, to the developing world from 1973 to 2003. And yet, at the same time, we saw per capita growth during this whole period drop dramatically. At the same time, we were providing more loans than ever. That's exactly the opposite of what the Lewis theory of savings, economic development will tell you. So just one case to illustrate what's going on, and that's the case of the Philippines, where at the end of World War II, Japan and the Philippines actually had a similar per capita income. By now, they're miles apart. In the late 40s, under MacArthur, the United States implemented a pretty progressive program for Japan. MacArthur was from the Philippines. But in Japan and Korea, he implemented land reform. He had a rapid deconcentration of industry, democracy and the rule of law. He encouraged domestic savings and made it difficult for foreign financial institutions to play a role. It was a pretty progressive program that this conservative general implemented in Japan. Unfortunately, in his home country of the Philippines, he did none of this. There was no land reform. Concentration of wealth continued to increase. The same people who had collaborated with the Japanese were left in power. And the Philippines ended up with one of the few communist revolutions in Asia. Roll forward to the 1980s, 1986, Ferdinand Marcos had been a dictator since 1973. He had basically, he was finally overthrown during that period, but not until he had been able to use the Philippine Central Bank as a piggy bank. I was able to go to the Philippines in 1987, investigated economics, go to the central bank, find the bank records, track down where the money had come from. New York banks like Manhattan were the principal lenders to the Philippine Central Bank. The funds were simply stolen by the bank and sent to Switzerland with these kinds of accounts. So this is just a fraction of what was stolen. This is the answer to how Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda made their real money during this period. It was odious debt. The Philippines, at the end of the day, was stuck with the loans. They're still servicing these loans in many cases. And the funds ended up in banks like Credit Suisse in Switzerland, in the private names of Marcos and his cronies. And today, Bongbong Marcos has returned power based on the huge fortune that he still has as a result of his father's industrious corruption and his access to foreign loans. So similar stories can be told about Paraguay. I've investigated General Stroessner, Lula, who is in power today only because of the enormous amount of corruption that existed in the 70s and 80s under Brazil's development program. Angola, where we have a $5 billion sovereign wealth fund looted by the son of Dos Santos and sent to Switzerland for Swiss bankers in the last 5 years. The case of Equatorial Guinea, another case of death by this fellow, Liang. The case of Argentina. A lot of people claim that Argentina is just this hopelessly corrupt country. Well, it's worth paying attention to what happened in Argentina. But in a nutshell, most of the debt that Argentina acquired since the 1970s was acquired by the military and by conservative governments like Carlos Menem. And most of that debt ended up financing capital flight, massive amounts of offshore wealth accumulation ending up in Miami and New York primarily. So indeed, Argentina is a prime example of a country that has been subject to this debt hoax, where much of the debt is stolen and expropriated and sent abroad. At the end of the day, the ultimate irony is this creates an opportunity for vulture capitalists to come back in, like the Singer Group, to buy up the bonds at discount prices that Argentina has issued and make phenomenal profits if they can get a friendly president, as they did in President Macri in 2016. He was elected with a lot of help from American vulture capitalists. And then he came back in and paid full market value, full face value for these bonds. At the end of the day, the third world so-called debt relief programs that we drummed up only returned out of the $4.4 trillion that was loaned about 7.8%. So it was minuscule. Most of that went to middle income countries as well. So debt relief efforts, which consumed an enormous amount of energy on the part of the world NGO community, amounted to a hill of beans in terms of solving this problem of social justice. We also saw a dramatic increase, and this is my kind of last hurrah here, in odious privatizations. Russia is the prime example, poster child for, in the 1990s, Russia did not get a Marshall Plan from the United States. It was a very contentious issue under both the Bush and Clinton administrations. Instead, they were required to sell off their state companies, and they sold them off to fund their recovery. They had basically a Great Depression in the 1990s. They sold 150,000 state companies for $9.7 billion, a pittance. This is a phenomenon that's gone on all over the world, where you have troubled states that get into deep water, and the vultures come and buy up properties. That ended up in Russia's case in there being about 25 to 30 people who owned most of the economy. And it also set the stage for the rise of President Putin. By 1996, less than 24 people had obtained control of Russia, while the US government was watching. So Robert Levinson and I made this presentation about that problem in 2005 to the World Policy Institute. We talked about it to no avail. I've gone to Moscow and investigated this. It was clear what was going on. There was no effort to curtail this phenomenon of creating a new oligarchy. And it also ended up facilitating organized criminals like this guy. He was one of the most prolific mafiosi in Russia. At the end of the day, it also, it's a long story that I go into in this article about the rise of Donald Trump's private Russian connections. He didn't really rely on Russian intervention in the election. He relied on patronage from Russians and Kazakhstan and other dubious offshore financiers to revive. So this is the answer to one of the riddles posed in our original session: where does Putin's portrait of his own czar portrait reside? This is in the Singapore Freeport in a locker, and that's where Putin has stashed it, pending, I guess, something restoration. We're not sure. Anyway, at the end of the day, I've talked enough here. I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious group. But it's clear to me that Brecht was right. It is capitalism that is truly radical. John, can you pitch in if you're still there?
Yep. Hi, Jim. Can you hear me? I'm definitely still here.
Okay.
Good. I have a PowerPoint, so if you can enable me to share, I want to talk through, pick up on some of the points about the enablers, because you've mentioned enablers many times, and I'd like to start off by talk about the enablers and talk about it from the perspective of my own experience. So if you can give me sharing rights, here we go. I will.
Yeah, have you given him sharing rights? I will unshare my screen. Yes, is that right?
Yep. And you should now have my PowerPoint up on your screen. Is that the case?
I'm gonna.
Are you seeing my PowerPoint on your screen? That's the key thing.
We're seeing you.
You should be seeing my PowerPoint. So let's go back to square one.
Okay. Can you press share screen on your?
I've done that, Jim. You should be seeing it.
Yes, we've got it. Okay, it's coming.
You've got
up.
it.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Very good. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the enablers and my own experience. And I'm going to go back to the mid-1980s. I finished my master's degree and I was working offshore. In fact, I was working in Malaysia. And I was working on an investigation into what had happened to about $800 million of deposit savings in so-called deposit-taking cooperatives, most of which were quite simply criminal devices operated by leading politicians and their cronies. $800 million of deposits had disappeared and largely disappeared offshore. And I was called in to help with the investigations. And that was a moment, I think, Jim, when I got out of my armchair and went out into the field. And I started looking at where this money had gone and bumped up against banks, accounting firms, trust companies, administrators, company formation agencies in a variety of jurisdictions in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in London, in Jersey, which is my home island, in Delaware, and so on. And that's when I knew that I needed to start focusing on this secretive world of offshore financial services and the role that enablers play. And on the screen in front of you, you've got a picture of the three monkeys seeing no evil, hearing no evil, and talking no evil. This is around the Panama Papers, because the Panama Papers, for me, is a culmination of a lot of work, and I worked closely with a team from Süddeutsche Zeitung who published this article. And what we were looking at was the extent to which banks and accounting firms and lawyers and others were the perpetrators of all of these activities. They were going out there and selling. It wasn't just the one law firm, Mossack Fonseca, because the company that I'd worked with in Jersey, which is Deloitte's, one of the world's biggest accounting firms, used Mossack Fonseca to a very large extent, and I used them as well. So it was this is the phenomenon that's had infiltrated right the way through what I think of as the gatekeepers of capitalism. And I was originally trained as a forensic auditor, and I did quite a bit of work offshore with Deloitte, and I'll talk a bit more about that work later on. But I decided that what I had to do after finishing the investigations in Malaysia was to actually go offshore, get out of the armchair, into the field and go and work with one of these big offshore companies and found out how they work. So I wanted to share with you some of my experience of working with one of the world's biggest accounting firms in their offshore division. So when we talk about the enablers, we're talking about quite a wide global infrastructure of financial and legal professionals. It's not just accountants, bankers, I think company administrators, non-executive company directors, trustees, even politicians and local authority, the senior civil servants who work in these offshore jurisdictions that Jim has been talking about, fall into this category of enablers. By the way, that film, HSBC, The Gangsters of Finance, it came out in France. I was involved in its production. Well worth watching because HSBC has been one of the world's biggest enablers and remains a money laundering operation to this day. And I can say that with impunity and no fear of libel because they themselves have fessed up to it in court. But HSBC are by no means unique in this respect. Now, first of all, just in case you think that offshore is a physical geographic phenomenon, it is not. Offshore relates technically to the practice of recording a transaction in a different country to where the transaction actually takes place. So I'm sitting in London, and if I recorded a transaction as having taken place in Paris, to all intents and purposes, Paris is the offshore part of that transaction. And that's important because we think that offshore is kind of just consists of an infrastructure of tiny jurisdictions. But actually, as Jim has already explained, some of the biggest players are major countries. The United States certainly belongs in that list, so does Germany, so does the United Kingdom, and arguably many other major countries, which allow this globalized financial infrastructure to use secrecy arrangements to enable offshore transactions to be booked. If we look at, this is a report going back to the mid-noughties, US Senate inquiry into tax haven abuses, the enablers, the tools of secrecy. They identified a wide range of tools. If you're not familiar with them, include shell companies, discretionary and charitable trusts, bearer shares, which by and large are now made illegal in most countries, flee clauses, which are triggered the moment that any investigator, including even a journalist, starts asking questions about a company or a trust. The company administration team are instructed by these existing flee clauses to shift the company to a different jurisdiction instantaneously and highly secretively. Redomiciliation clauses, again, it's quite similar. Protected cell companies, multi-jurisdictional structures, off-balance sheet accounting, and I would add cryptocurrencies to this list. Hold a second, let me just go down there. So my first step in getting out of the armchair and getting into the field was to go back to the Channel Island of Jersey, which is where I'd grown up. And I worked for quite a few years with Deloitte's in their offshore division. And working in the offshore division meant that I had access to a large number of client accounts that I was technically administering. And this is what I found from my client accounts. They were engaged in insider trading, market rigging, avoiding disclosure of conflicts of interest, illicit arms trading, illicit political campaign donations, contract kickbacks, bribery, fraudulent invoicing and trade mispricing, evading creditors, in many cases evading creditors, including spouses in divorce cases, and of course tax evasion. I looked at over 120, quite very carefully, at over 120 of the clients, and not a single one of them fell outside of one or other of these categories. In other words, here was one of the world's biggest accounting firms using an offshore trust and company administration subsidiary to enable criminal activity from clients from across the world. And the fascinating thing is that no red flags ever came up at any stage. You know, even if I raised concerns, they were kind of brushed aside. This was normal. Here's a case study, and I think it's a very interesting case study because in some respects it just helps to explain that massive looting of the global south that Jim was talking about. So here was a client of mine. The client was a Jersey-based offshore subsidiary of an upstream oil production venture operated by a global super major oil company in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. And the company I was charged with administering, and that's not the real name, but it does give you a little bit of a clue as to which company, which oil super major we might be dealing with, was called Crustacea Jersey Limited. And the role of that company was exclusively, just one single role, once a month to issue an invoice for unspecified engineering consulting services to a subsidiary in Nigeria. And that subsidiary was the operating division of just one well, just one oil production well, which, by the way, was a joint venture. And the invoice I issued in those days fell somewhere between $500,000 monthly to about $1.5 million. We varied it month by month to make it appear that there were genuine engineering services. There were none, by the way. The payment would be made to an offshore bank account held in St. Helier, Jersey. That was held by Barclays Limited, from memory, and then made to a bank account in another bank held in the name of a trust company that had been set up in Bermuda. And it was then, the sums were then dispersed to a whole galaxy, many more than, you know, the crab, lobster, shrimp, the whole galaxy of offshore shell companies. That's a pun, by the way, but don't worry. I had no idea. To this day, I have no idea who were the beneficiaries of those, or were the owners of those offshore shell companies. But I'm guessing that they were likely to be Nigerian politicians and senior officials of the Nigerian oil company. But the important thing is, look at how many different financial professionals and legal professionals were involved in these processes. Obviously, finance directors, administrators, senior partners, law firms, trust companies, senior partners of the various company administration, in various companies set up in Cayman, and so on, plus an unknown number of bankers in Cayman, Jersey, Switzerland, and so on. In total, just for this one transaction, monthly transaction, for all I know, it's still going on, we can assume that there were at least 15 financial and legal professionals, largely based in the so-called West, who were busily involved in turning a blind eye to what was going on here, which was looting of oil assets. And that, I think, one of my key messages is that never expect anyone to start raising red flags or blowing the whistle if their salary depends upon them turning a blind eye to what's going on, because the vast majority of people are going to put their salaries and their well-being before anything to do with financial integrity. And that raises questions about the culture of the offshore industry. And I've been working quite a lot in recent years with sociologists and anthropologists talking about this. And in fact, in 2015, I was commissioned to write an article for a book called Neoliberalism and the Moral Economy of Fraud. And I wrote a chapter in that book looking at the moral economy of tax professionals. And I conducted over 30 interviews with senior partners of law firms and accounting firms across the world. And all of them said that, because this was anonymous, all of them said, yeah, they recognized that there was no ethics in what they were doing. They basically had to park their morals and their ethics at home first thing in the morning, go off and do their work in a kind of ethics-free environment, and then go home at night and hope that on Sunday they might somehow be able to buy an indulgence or get exoneration for their crimes. But the culture was extraordinary. This quote came from a Guardian newspaper article. They interviewed a guy called Guy Smith, tax advisor, one of the boutique tax advising companies in London. He said, no matter what legislation is in place, the accountants and lawyers will find a way around it. Rules are rules, but rules are meant to be broken. So this isn't some kind of Occupy Wall Street anarchist. This is a senior partner of a tax advisory business. This is from KPMG's website. They withdrew it pretty soon after we drew attention to that. Tax avoidance does not damage corporate reputations and may even enhance them. And this from the US Senate Permanent Committee on Investigations. KPMG knowingly, purposefully, and willfully violated the federal tax shelter law. And they did that because KPMG knew that the potential fines that could be imposed upon them for breaking federal tax law were lower than the profits they made from the fees they charged their clients. So actually promoting illegal tax measures and knowing full well that they might be investigated and would fall apart was actually a profit center for them. Now, in talking with these professionals about the culture they worked in, it was clear to me that they justify their activities in all sorts of ways, one of which was to say, oh, hell, we don't do tax evasion. We know that's illegal, but we do tax avoidance. And yet, in so many cases, when we challenged, and we have challenged a large number of so-called tax avoidance schemes, and when revenue authorities do that, in many cases, the challenges are sustained in the court, and the schemes are found to be unacceptable. So there's no clear line. There's no clear line between them. In fact, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer once said the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion is the thickness of a prison wall, because by and large, if you say, well, we were exploring a tax avoidance scheme, even though we thought it might fail, then you're unlikely to be sent to prison for it. Another myth, and I heard this from company directors over many, many years, is that they have a duty to minimize tax. It's part of minimizing costs. Well, of course, from an economist's point of view, the idea that tax is a cost of business is ridiculous. I mean, it's not. It's like dividend payments, it's a distribution. Dividends are paid to shareholders, taxes are paid to the states in which you're operating and making the profits. And if you doubt that, just take a look at a profit and loss account, income and expenditure account. Tax is always shown below the bottom line. In other words, it's accountants themselves know full well that this is not a cost. This is a distribution. And when we got a legal opinion from a very prominent King's Counsel in the UK, who was a tax specialist, that King's Counsel reported back saying there is nothing in the law in this country or in any other countries which require directors to promote tax avoidance, to increase dividend payments to their shareholders. So these myths have built up. Another myth that's very often used is, the tax competitiveness encourages investment. Well, just look at that chart of investment in the UK running up to running up to the COVID period up to 2018. It's quite clear that the UK, which has been one of the leading countries using tax cuts to attract inward investment, hasn't achieved its task at all. If anything, investment has shunned the UK for all sorts of other reasons, but tax cuts are not likely to be a reason for a proper investor to invest in a country. Quite the opposite. And finally, in many cases, the tax avoidance schemes here in the UK and in many countries are sustained by legal opinions, and those legal opinions, if a tax scheme is taken to court, are held up to the court to support the case. But here you have, again, a leading and very prominent UK tax King's Counsel, in other words, an extremely senior legal person, saying that he has seen opinions which in many cases are so far removed from legal reality that it's hard to believe that the person who issued those legal opinions, and very often these are senior tax lawyers, actually believes what they're saying. At worst, they're criminally fraudulent and they're obtaining fees by deception. And I've talked to people across the world, and all of them have said, all of these tax people have said, yeah, we have a similar situation in our country, where you have very high-ranking lawyers issuing opinions to support schemes which basically are fraudulent. So there's some insights into the culture of the enabling industry. Does it matter? I would say it matters enormously, because if you look at it at the macro level from an economist's point of view, this whole haven industry and the secrecy that accompanies it impacts the global economy in an entirely negative way. It raises risk premiums, if nothing else, because in many cases when we're doing due diligence, we have really no idea who we're dealing with behind these offshore companies. It harms tax systems and public finance. That's a no-brainer, but it also facilitates economic free-riding. It reduces the efficiency of resource allocation. It increases the profitability of economic crime. It encourages people, very wealthy people, to engage in rent-seeking activities. And it damages institutional quality at every single level, especially at the judicial level. These are not my opinions or my conclusions. Quite a few years ago, the government of Norway appointed a royal commission to look at the work that we were doing at the Tax Justice Network. And that independent commission of economists these are their key conclusions from that independent research into our work. So I want to leave you with some recommendations for tackling the enablers. This is not, Jim said, there's lots that can be done and some things that can be done immediately. First of all, we can put pressure on professional associations to strengthen their members' guidelines and to enforce those guidelines. We've been doing that for some time, and to a certain degree with some success. We certainly could and should restrict professional client privilege to situations involving representation before a court of law, but there must be full compliance with statutory transactional reporting. We can place all tax-related court verdicts and tax rulings onto online public record as a reputation deterrent, because nothing would deter lawyers and company accountants and so on more than actually having their misdemeanors made public. And perhaps this is the most important thing. We should need to properly resource investigating and tax authorities and prosecutors to conduct the expensive and time-consuming cases against the enablers, just to encourage, pour encourager les autres, as they say here, or as Molière, or maybe Voltaire, I think it was Voltaire, said many years ago, the best way of getting the attention of these lawyers and bankers is to threaten them with really serious punitive actions. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. I hope you found that of interest. If you want to look at more of the work we've done in this area, the Spider's Web, it's a film I produced a few years ago, is currently up on Netflix. You can also watch it on YouTube in its entirety, and it takes you deeper into the world, this terrible and shocking world of offshore secrecy havens, with a particular look at Britain's Second Empire. And I would leave you with this last word. As far as Britain was concerned, creating a secretive spider's web of offshore havens in Cayman, Bermuda, Channel Islands, British Virgin Islands, Gibraltar, on, even Singapore and Hong Kong back in the day. This was a key part of their post-imperial development strategy, and in many respects can be seen as a continuation of imperialism in a different form. So, Jim, back to you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or receive any comments on this.
Great, outstanding. I'm going to.
Simply outstanding, John. Any questions for John briefly? If we have other speakers waiting in the wings, anyone got a quick question for John? Okay.
I have a quick question. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned that civil servants were failing to address this, or one of these enabler categories, failing to address this problem of offshore tax havens. Is this a problem of a capacity issue at the regulators? Is it a revolving door issue? Where do you think the source of like public servant enabling of this problem is coming from?
Yeah, look, first of all, thanks for the question. As it happens, I've spent today talking with a sociologist from University College London about precisely that issue. So you couldn't be more timely in the question. I think my answer would be it's all of the above. Certainly, my experience has been, a shocking degree of revolving doors between the big four accounting firms and major law firms, going into tiny jurisdictions, whether it's Bahamas or Channel Islands or Bermuda or wherever, going there, recognizing that the polities are extremely weak. I mean, seriously weak. These are tiny places with very weak political arrangements, and also weak and unsophisticated judiciaries. So it's easy to capture both the state and the judiciary. And that's something I think that Darren and Tanya can talk about as well, because they've got a lot of insights into judicial capture, particularly in Jersey. So you have weak polities to begin with. You certainly have revolving doors, but you also, and this is perhaps the bit that most disturbed me, because as Jim said in the introduction, for 10 years, I headed the Government Economic Service in Jersey, and I was a little bit disillusioned by the extent to which civil servants didn't do their job, which is to provide professional advice on good governance matters, and to raise their hands and say, sorry, Minister, but what you're proposing here is illegal in international law, or contravenes the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, or whatever the hell it is. By and large, the civil servants were either too concerned about their own career prospects, or in many cases simply weren't up to the job, because small island polities and small island civil services, by and large, the civil servants have rings run round them by the international lawyers and the bankers and the accounting firms. So I think it's, my answer to your question is just all of the above.
Good. John, great presentation. Let's move right on to Khadija in South Africa.
Jim, there's another hand up. That's Tul Osman has got a hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sure this, maybe this question could wait until later if we're short on time, but I was wondering, I know you're talking about the psychological or the sociological side of this, and I was wondering how you see that there's a psychological, maybe individual study, if that's something that exists, about why individuals such as public servants or people who are involved in this, is there some kind of study or some kind of attempt to understand why people maybe choose their income over integrity when they face these ethical situations?
Yeah. It's interesting. In the last 10 years, the whole haven industry has come under much greater scrutiny. I mean, particularly since Panama Papers, the HSBC leaks, and so on. The whole thing's come under greater scrutiny, and Jim, I think, had played a key part in putting the enablers, right to the front here. But I think there's a dearth of really good research in this area, and that was the conclusion we came to this morning here, talking to the sociologists from University College London. We really need to understand much more about what's going on here. If you look at the work of Brooke Harrington was Copenhagen Business School, but she's an American, and she herself got out of her armchair, went into the field and worked with wealth managers and I think private equity for quite a long time, and she was looking at it very much from the kind of the psychological and the sociological aspects of this, and she's done some very good work there. But I think there's much more that needs to be done in this area. It's a very rich and intriguing field. We're looking at late capitalism, and certainly, I grew up, quite a few decades ago. We thought that people like lawyers and accountants and auditors, company directors, thought of them as the gatekeepers of capitalism. Their role was to ensure the integrity of the businesses. Auditors were there precisely to do just that. But then in the last 30 years, we've seen audit, and I originally trained as an auditor, but audits have been degraded to the point where in many cases they're not worth the paper they're printed on. So the integrity of these professions has diminished. And I think public respect for the professionals has diminished alongside that. And certainly the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and others have contributed to this loss of respect for the professional people. And rightly so. I'm not criticizing the public. I think the public are absolutely right in this. But I think there's a huge issue, a massive issue that needs to be addressed here.
Terrific. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions because we've got so many great speakers here. I'm embarrassed. Embarrassed and appreciate you. John, thank you so much. Khadija, are you still with us?
Yes. Should I turn my camera on or just leave it off?
Please, it's up to you. Where are you? In Durban?
Yes.
Yeah, please turn your camera on if the internet can stand it. See you again.
Okay. I don't have a PowerPoint. I thought I would just organically follow up with what's been said. I work with the OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, for the past 10 years as a senior global investigative reporter. And the privilege of this is that we get to jump borders where national law enforcement must file for access and say please and wait a few years, by which time the unjust behavior has actually moved on. It's morphed, it's changed form. So the whole world, particularly law enforcement, must react to criminality, to illicit activity. It's a kind of a hunt. And the only people who get to jump borders are the investigative journalists. And that's often why a thing will break and then law enforcement will catch up, where the purchase of the law has not already been corrupted before it's been turned into law. Because as journalists, we're taught to go after almost a headline: who has broken the law, who has busted sanctions. But in reality, the difference between, as John mentioned, the extra legal activity and legalized criminality just depends on the jurisdiction that you're in and the regime that's in power, who has the power to make the law. And what we've seen in the world is that the privilege conferred to shareholders, not stakeholders, is that of capital. That's the primary value in the world. It is the principle that drives economies and markets, whether or not they want it, and people have just fallen into line. So when it comes to investigative reporting, as far as the public knows, it's largely kind of shaped around big data leaks. We have many of those, too many to develop, and hackers do this for sports. There's a lot of ethical hackers. You can even put in a request, and if you know someone, just ask them to get a certain leak, which isn't legal. Don't do that, although I may have done it, but that's off the record. And often these big leaks involve banks and accounting firms, trust firms, law firms, because everything in the world runs through them. And if you want to find what is unjust, whether it's legal or illegal, it will come from them because they have created the paper trail for it. So the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center leak, and Dubai is the world's biggest gold laundering hub, the biggest cash for gold market with no paper trail. We're able to see that the DMCC itself is unable to internally audit their own system against residual risk, intrinsic inherent risks. So they can't even begin to regulate their clients because the way that the system has been designed is so loose and so contradictory and inconsistent that they themselves have no rules of operation. There's no systemic integrity, and therefore anything goes. And the only thing that protects them is the fact that it is kind of cloaked in financial secrecy because the law has rendered it in that way. And so now with these big leaks, Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, it's tip of the tongue self-evident that enablers are the ones sort of making the rules. And even the small island jurisdictions like the Seychelles, for example, they're very economically vulnerable. They're caught between coconuts and criminality, and they commercialize their sovereignty for the price of a parking ticket, because none of that money stays in vulnerable jurisdictions where if a bank collapses, the state cannot bail it out. So they move their money through these little jurisdictions as transit points in a bigger supply chain, and they put it somewhere that's politically stable, like Switzerland or Luxembourg, where they have specifically designed laws to protect that money as a vault. So in Switzerland, if a banker does the right thing and discloses, he will go to prison because doing the right thing is against the law. And so, for example, in the Seychelles, the Minister of Justice didn't even know where the FIC, where the Financial Investigative Center, the arm of the government was. And it was just a few streets away. And the now deceased head of the FIC had no idea or interest in the actual laws of his tiny island. He just said, it gives us 7% of the GDP and we need it. We're pretty broke, because most of those people have nothing. They have absolutely nothing. They're living on state subsidies. And a lot of these small islands have to import food because they don't grow it. And so everything, there's a lot of regressive taxation, high VAT. A bottle of Coca-Cola will cost you 4 times what it'll cost you in a normal country. So these are the islands that have been framed as the villainous actors, but in fact, they're just transit hubs. So often when we get leaks, they can be fragmented, they can be consolidated. In the case of South Africa's HSBC data set, it came from someone who was specifically auditing Zuma Inc., the president's financial structure. And at the time, HSBC registered South Africa as having the 3rd highest profit base out of all of their bank branches globally. And that's specifically related to state capture and another issue, which was the Steinhoff issue. But when it comes down to looking at data, the leaks are just the leads, they're not the stories, and you have to follow through with 90% of the story, which inevitably takes you away from what is known as the offshore, and it takes you right back to the onshore, where the accounting firms and the banks and the law firms have created a kind of parallel superstructure for these systems, which are very lucrative business models to perform. So when you're looking through the data sets, and I'll focus on banks, you look for things that have a wrinkle, names, companies, jurisdictions where no real activity occurs, or where activity is displaced. It can be a developing nation or a secrecy jurisdiction, or even just an office in a nowhere street in the middle of Luxembourg or Portugal. You look for rounded figures, repeat figures, the recycling of names. For example, with Iran's biggest oil exporter, the US government kept sanctioning the pop-up shell companies, but they never looked to the 3 underlying state-owned Chinese banks. 180 shell companies had the same 7 Iranian trustees on those accounts. So sometimes you see a government making a political move, like sanctioning the pop-up companies that take 24 hours to create, but not going after the bigger actor because there'll be political repercussions. So it's really important to look to the system of how that business model performs, and is it too lucrative to ever stop, or is it too politically embedded to actually confront at this time? And I think one of the biggest things we look for, particularly with bank leaks, is human behavior, because no matter how well you legislate against corruption, corruption is a culture. It's based on human behavior, and it's always predictable. So even where they try to conceal it or disrupt the pattern, they inevitably reproduce another pattern that then has a paper trail that links to banks or law firms or trust firms or whatever. So for example, in the Gambia, there was no leak. We were just told to go in and find the story. $1 billion stolen. And we basically got this through 20,000 documents given to us in giant suitcases, not the kind that you move your luggage in, but the kind that people move their lives in, the moldy, tough, torn at the seam kind. And we were in a ruined mansion in a deserted town next to a brothel, rats the size of cats. And in there you see Citibank processing tens of millions of dollars from New York for the dictator of the Gambia through something called the president's account. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the importance of liquidity, for banks. And at that time, we smelt that waste, we felt that hunger, and it pushed us to go through, and we're able to see, Total, the oil company in France, has given a monopoly to Hezbollah, a US sanctioned militant group, and Hezbollah is laundering money into the Gambia, not out of it. So the flags that people will sometimes look for can be in reverse. You don't only look for what's stolen. If you look for the systemic integrity of things, you'll be able to see where things are contradictory, broken, or the cracks exist. So in this case, it was done through what was called the number one bank, the central bank. They used dormant accounts, repurposed it, and then outsourced it to 20 Western banks, Barclays Bank, Standard Bank. And none of these banks raised the red flag because it's liquidity, and they budget for illegal behavior as fines. It's very, very hard to prove because they know that the people who are laundering through their banks will create multi-jurisdictional layers, they'll create proxies, and they'll use shell companies. And even where people legislate against things like bearer shares, in Russia, they have a new alternative investment fund model called ZPIFs. You don't need a bearer share anymore because the AIFs now become a vehicle that banks will do a KYC on, and the beneficiaries are hidden. So every time law enforcement reacts and catches up, the lobbying group from the accounting firms and the law firms pressure the government to dilute the laws so that very little will ultimately be criminal in the jurisdiction where the activities occur. Take the example of the European Union. They're supposed to be the hub of integrity, but in Angola, we found that the vice president, the head of the military, and the head of the oil company were able to circumvent all of the EU's laws by creating their own banks on European soil. And because the shareholders of the banks were also the biggest clients, there was no one to report on wrongdoing. And it wasn't just money moving through their own cash, but inflating the shares of shell banks also generated like $200-300 million in profit because they could internally impute the value of the shares that they wanted to sell to themselves. And that's a very easy thing to do. So John mentioned cryptocurrencies. With Tether, you can see that the bulk of Tether clients are shell companies that are investing in an internally imputed security that's not yet declared a security. The bulk of it comes from Asia, and no cryptocurrency entity, whether it's Tether or Binance, can ever be audited because the system isn't designed for them to be audited. So nobody can actually value something that isn't yet formalized as a security in law and which algorithm cannot be assessed by these guys. So they have all sorts of ways of getting out of the very few and narrow rules that have been created because people are focusing, lawmakers are trained, and there is an incentive for them to focus on low-hanging fruit, not on the people who make the rules. And it's the one who make the rules that have the biggest benefit coming to them when their clients wash money through their systems. Sovereign wealth funds also perform as a massive kind of bank. In Libya, $64 billion oil fund created by Gaddafi. When the UN sanctioned and the EU sanctioned the sovereign wealth fund, they created a parallel structure in Malta that then gave them access to the entirety of the EU and all of the EU's banks. And because they were performing through shell companies, the EU simply could not catch up. The UN could not find what was the actual legitimate structure to sanction. They ended up cracking down on 550 of 4,700. So the bulk of it simply was able to move outside of Libya and into Malta and then into the EU. And we can go into specifics about the big banks like Credit Suisse, but at the end of the day, you know, even from that 30-year leak, you can see a lot of it is smoke and mirrors. And these relationship officers deliberately look past, don't ask the questions and or downgrade the risk in order to bank the big clients because they set aside a budget for fines. So when you're doing an investigation, particularly concerning a bank, you're trying to build a criminal docket. You're trying to find patterns of predictability, and nothing can ever truly disappear. At the end of the day, you see the global system is configured to value shareholders, not stakeholders, to value capital, not human beings. So capital can move within 10 minutes across the world, but a human being will die in a boat en route to a place of safety that has actually destroyed the country, you know, from which they are coming, because the rules of the game are configured to valorize and prioritize capital. So the economy is at the top, and the ecology and human society is a subset of this. And even if the earth cannot perform at the rate that it is performing, because of fractional reserve banking, where 10% of funds are actually held in reserve and 90% must be derived from interest rates and profit, more profit, more profit. So everything is consumed and bought and sold at a faster and faster rate, like a treadmill. And even where they create systems like carbon credits, a lot of the times these projects don't even exist. It's pushed off to a developing country that nobody will ever visit, where the forest is actually a slum or a dump already raised down for palm oil. So at the end of the day, even the system of easy virtue, of EITI, of free range, of FSC timber, a lot of this is smoke and mirrors, where the regulators of the easy virtue systems are the same people that benefit from it. So who finances EITI? The companies. And what is reported? What the government stole, not what they should have paid. So that's how the system is created, and where we as consumers get caught in that trap of the financiers. Buy a bracelet to save the rhinos. But if the ecology of the rhinos is gone, and there's trade finance happening where drugs is traded for rhino horn that's then cashed in through a bank that becomes fiat currency in the UK, who's really going to look into it? Because the banks have yet to even create legislation that looks for wildlife trafficking, that looks into the substance. Is a safari company actually dealing in tiger bones and rhino horns, which has a higher street value than a kg of cocaine? So all of this is relative to what the people who make the rules actually value. And as media, we have fallen short because we go for headlines, and the headline is angels and demons, heroes and villains, the bad dictator, the bank that maybe helped or didn't help. But now with the leaks, it's kind of becoming tip of the tongue, and people are realizing, thanks to the work of the Tax Justice Network and thinkers like Thomas Pokey and Jim Henry, they're kind of realizing that this is the system, this is the supply of the system, and those guys are just using it as a demand side factor. So at the end of the day, what we've seen is that the biggest criminals in almost every story we've looked at are the banks. They downgrade high-risk activities, they value liquidity above all else, and they engage in the same thing they're supposed to be looking out for. You find that Europe's 20 biggest banks declare their profits in jurisdictions where they have no employees. And in jurisdictions where they do, they have very little profit. So they have gamed the system, written the rules for the system, and then add the pressure as a lobbying entity to force governments to dilute laws to the point where the laws themselves have no value. What is illegal is now so scarce that you'd have to be a dumb fucking criminal to actually break the law. Sorry for swearing. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Outstanding, outstanding. Hard to salute you. Question, quick one. Anyone? I mean, I'm amazed. Let's go on to Andreas, because we're going to run out of time here. And this is a phenomenal discussion.
Okay. I'm here.
You've just heard from Khadija. What's your
Oh,
response to that?
absolutely. I couldn't agree more with her. So,
So where are you, and what is it?
I make it short as we are running out of time. So, as you mentioned, in my first life, I was a banker with Goldman Sachs and HSBC. I would like to remind the audience that money laundering became a crime in 1993 before it was legal. So when I worked with Goldman Sachs, it was a private company. The first thing I got at Goldman Sachs was a book about business ethics. That's no joke. Now, it was it, and the financial markets are a casino and is ruled by illicit money. But I shut short what I want to say. But James, you said that I'm going to file a complaint with the Commission. That's not correct. I'm filing a complaint with the European Court of Justice. As I work with the Commission since 2004, I have filed 5 complaints with the Commission, of which 2 turned into infringement cases. Never happened before, never after. Germany, after the second infringement case, is interfering with the Commission. And so the 3rd, 4th, and the 5th were closed without any change in the system. But what I can prove is that the Commission is not enforcing the EU anti-money laundering. Just even I can prove by documents that the Commission is willingly preventing the enforcement of the anti-money laundering directive. What you have got is the complaint. It's gone up to 110 pages. And there you can read the proof how this works over a period of 19 years working with the Commission. And this is the access I have to the problems you were describing before. I think it's the governments, especially governments of the Western world, that are not enforcing the law. I remember the Honorable Secretary of the Treasury, Yellen, said in December 2021, the best place to hide and launder money is the US. So I want to tell you a story. I was invited by the Parliament of Guatemala. I gave a speech and I said, Guatemala is a nice country, very nice people, but a lot of money laundering problems with the rule of law and trafficking and other crimes. And, I looked in the audience and some people wanted to kill me. So I said, next slide, please. And I said, welcome to the club. You're not different from the US and from the European Union. And this is exactly the problem we are facing at the moment, because the Western countries are not enforcing the laws against money laundering and the finance of terror. How can we expect the offshore countries you were talking about, John, or countries in the East or in Africa, how can we expect that they enforce the law? Impossible. But we are facing worldwide problems. I'm saying that our generation leaves to the next generation a world of crisis. These crises are interconnected. There's a super trend for chaos building. Climate crisis means that large areas of the world will be inhabitable. Food crisis means that as many as 820 million people were affected by hunger in 2021, increasing by 150 million since 2019. Refugee crisis, the latest report talks about 1.2 trillion refugees by 2050. So if we share between Europe and the US, the refugees will be the majority in our countries. I think our politicians, should face the reality and should start to enforce the law. Yesterday, Europol published a new report supporting all my arguments, but nothing is done. So I would like to ask you, students, if you have a chance, could you please read the complaint for the European Court of Justice? I think there is a lot of information in there. And because, as you hear, English is not my native tongue, I need some help from you or from others that are participating at this panel. Thank you. So this was fast.
Great. Will we read the complaint? It's on the reserve in the canvas, the entire first version and a new version. I just put up the new version as well. There's also an article from the ICIJ that talks very similar to what, and a new study by Europol that Andreas provided, which comes to similar conclusions.
But if you could please, it's confidential until I send it out to the European Court of Justice. So it's just you reading it, and but it's important because in Europe the law says that the Commission has absolute discretionary power when it is processing or handling a complaint. So the European Commission is deciding if the EU Anti-Money Laundering Directive is enforced or not. So they are more or less above the law. And my complaint is asking the European Court of Justice if they could change their case law and give some limits to the discretionary power of the European Commission. So if somebody's interested, I mean, you're facing similar problems in the US, and maybe it gives you some insight of the work I've done for the last 19 years. Thank you.
I think one of the interesting questions you've raised is what would be the equivalent process in the US, because we basically have similar lapses in enforcement with respect to not only anti-money laundering laws, but fraud and other statutes. There is no American Court of Justice at the moment other than the Supreme Court. I'm not sure about the UK, but is there any equivalent process outside of the EU? John, do you?
He's no longer with us.
No, I think he's.
No, I
Yes, okay.
definitely with you. And sorry, I'm not sure whether you can see me or hear me. But the answer is no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this would be a useful thing to. Now, Andreas, I first met in 2015, I believe. We were taking
Department of
advantage
Labor, Credit Suisse.
Yeah, and Department of Labor has an interesting role in the world. They're supposed to tell big banks whether or not they are allowed to do qualified pension asset management programs for pension funds, U.S. public pension funds. QPANs is the technical term. You should all know, it'll be on the exam. But anyway, they're supposed to be able to kick convicted corporations that have pled guilty to felonies out of the QPAN system. And so Andreas, Ralph Nader, we had Holocaust victims who had never been paid by Credit Suisse, a great professor from Australia who's an expert on Credit Suisse's misbehavior there. All this came together for a day of hearings in Washington, in which the Department of Labor was seriously looking at the evidence that we accumulated about Credit Suisse's serial misbehavior. This was in January 2015. They had just pled guilty to a corporate felony in the United States for helping facilitate money laundering by more than 21,000 wealthy Americans to set up a secret division, taking the money to Switzerland. Anyway, at the end of all this, they received basically a waiver. And Ralph Nader said at the time, we have a virtually parallel history of giving waivers to these big banks. Well, roll forward, as we predicted, in 2021, they ran into a conviction in Mozambique with respect to another piece of chicanery involving fraudulent loans to the Mozambique government. And this time the Department of Justice had convicted them of corruption. And they had another felony on their record. And they, between those two dates, they had engaged in all kinds of other misbehaviors. So finally, last year, Credit Suisse was kicked out of the QPEN system. But then we were invited back last fall to submit recommendations. And what we identified was the fact that Credit Suisse's new parent, UBS, is just, if not worse, possibly just even worse, as well as any number of other these big banks, HSBC, Barclays, we mentioned a few of them, JP Morgan, which today it was just revealed that they had concealed $1 billion of suspicious activity reports that they're supposed to send to the FinCEN regulatory agency, the U.S. Treasury's regulatory agency on money laundering. $1 billion since 2003 regarding Jeffrey Epstein and his human trafficking transactions with JP Morgan, facilitated by that bank, over 16 years. So for 16 years, JP Morgan was concealing $1 billion in human trafficking offenses. Finally, after Epstein died in prison, they decided it was safe to let the Treasury know they had all these funny money transactions involving prostitution going through their bank. This is another glaring example. But Andreas, what do we do about this? Is there any other than the EU? Department of Labor, we're still waiting to hear whether they accepted our recommendations in 9 months.
We
to go
have
out to other institutions.
I'll give you an example. I was invited to Kenya, Nairobi Parliament. And in front of me, there was the Minister of Interior and the President of the Parliament. I was talking about the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative from the World Bank, and that according to the figures I got from an organization that is dealing with Africa, 120 billion is going into developing aid from the good people from the West to Africa, and 800 billion is stolen every year. This can't work out. So I was looking to the two guys, and they were very interested because they were thinking there is money flowing back to them. And I said, we cannot exchange one kleptocrat with the others. They didn't like what I said. So, but that's the serious problem. How do we distribute all the money that is sitting in European and US bank accounts stolen from Africa? Africa needs support, financial support. And, this is how do we distribute it? The UN cannot be trusted. Who's going to do it? So, working in this field for 25 years, you don't have, or you have little trust in all of those organizations.
I'm happy to take the whole 120 billion if you want to send it my way.
Sure, give me your account number.
Well, obviously, we could do a whole nother session on a lot of these subjects, but I have to move on. I want to thank you, Andreas, for an outstanding presentation. All of the presentations here have been great. I want to go quickly to Darren and Tanya, who have been patiently waiting in Austin, where the temperature is what these days? Are you guys still with us?
But they show here. They show start.
Yeah, no, we're
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Sorry. Just
Right.
technically inept on how to unmute and turn the camera on. I want to try and build off of what has been said as well. I think that's pretty effective. Tanya and I are husband and wife, and we've turned into kind of the dynamic duo in reference to battling financial crimes globally. In 2012, Tanya and I had discovered that we had been the victims of a massive fraud where a bunch of family assets had been stolen. And it kind of threw us into this mixer, and we ended up going from victim to whistleblower to advocate. And so we've got a pretty unique perspective on how this all gets laid out. And one of the things I would add to what has been said is one of the reasons I think you really want to pay attention to this is that anybody that does a financial transaction has an interest in what we're talking about, which is everybody. I mean, you could take it as simple as anybody who wants to buy a house, and I could set you aside and in 5 minutes show you how the actions at these offshore jurisdictions, the actions of the offshore jurisdictions are having a huge impact on your ability to buy a house, whether it be the interest rates you're paying, the amount you're paying for the house, the banks you're able to work with. It's why you should be paying attention to it.
Or whether or not somebody's going to come in, transfer the title out of your name, and the money, boom, next thing you know, it's sitting in an offshore account and there's nothing you can do.
So the other part is whistleblowing, and that is a huge. One of the first questions was around, why don't these civil servants, why aren't they more vocal when they see something that's bad? And I would be hard pressed to come up with an example of where a whistleblower was actually congratulated. Most whistleblowers are crucified, and so it's a path that needs to be rectified. There's some legislation that's going on to kind of change some of that, but I think you can tell the health of a society by how whistleblowers are taken care of. And if we could find a way to create a better bubble for these whistleblowers, I think you'd see more real-time issues brought to bear. Tanya and I, when we got into the fraud, which involved the island of Jersey, I had no idea that every day, with my finance background, I was walking by transactions and people that were doing things that were questionable, and I kind of looked the other way. And it's kind of like a lie. At some point in time, it's going to come back up and bite you. And I wish I would have been told 25, 30 years ago, you should pay more attention to this because it will affect your life. We ended up in the middle of the superhighway of fraud, and through another long story on time for another day, but Tanya and I had come across a bunch of documents that are similar to the Panama Papers, about 400,000 documents on the island of Jersey covering all these financial transactions by all the players that we've mentioned.
What was different about these, and they're called the Jersey boxes, and what made them very, very different was that they were for a specific small boutique trust company. And so all the things that people say, well, we think that's what they were doing. This is what we think they were doing to perpetrate the fraud. They were manufacturing papers. They were manufacturing debt, but we just can't prove it. Well, these guys were pack rats, and they kept everything. The stuff they put in writing, down to instructions on how to fabricate documents using old paper and old ink. I mean, every detailed instruction was there.
And so we ended up delving into this fraud issue because obviously it had been perpetrated on us. But as we poked our heads up, we just kept running into more and more and more people. And we basically had to learn how to speak Crook.
It's a different language.
Yeah, it really is. And these offshore jurisdictions in this.
Can you move slightly together because we're missing half of Darren?
You're getting the better half.
Oh, I just want to see more of you.
Okay.
There you are. The other way.
The other way. There you go.
go.
Okay. So anyway, we figured out that we needed to learn how to speak Crook, and basically getting into money laundering and why it's so relevant to society is that guys, if you're going to steal $1 million, your moral compass isn't going to stop you from being involved in things like the story you guys were just talking about, like with Epstein and the pedophilia. There's a thing called circularity, where when you start looking at fraud, you start seeing the same transactions over and over again, but more important, the same people. And they just keep showing up over and over and over again. And part of getting the word out there is that once you understand circularity, it isn't hard to identify fraud. And then we started putting together these things called the hallmarks of fraud. And I'll just touch on one of them. And it really kind of goes back to John Christensen's story about when he started discussing the issues on Jersey, where he said that they had 120 companies that they were representing them, and none of them were doing legitimate business. Well, the circularity is that once you go back in and realize it's not only those transactions, but it's most every transaction that they're involved in involves some form of malfeasance. And so we've got a quick story in reference to the hallmark of fraud, and everybody's probably seen the movie Goodfellas, and we basically break fraud down into 5 steps, and it's the 5th step that is the one that I think is the most interesting. In the movie Goodfellas, there's a guy that owns a restaurant, and all of the mobsters go into the restaurant and they run up the bar tabs with booze and the food.
Their favorite place to hang out.
Yeah, and but they never pay their tabs. So finally, the restaurant owner goes back to the mob boss Paulie and says, "Paulie,
Talk to your guys.
yeah, you guys are killing me, man. I got to pay the bill." And Paulie's like, "I'm not their mother. I mean, you go talk to them." So the restaurant guy goes home and he thinks about it overnight, and he decides that what he really needs to do is make Paulie the mob boss's partner, because the mobsters won't rob from Paulie. So he goes back to Paulie the next day and he says, "Paulie, I want to make you a partner." And Paulie says, "What do I know about restaurant business?" And finally, after negotiations, Paulie becomes the guy's partner. Well, the next scene of the movie is Paulie is buying all the booze and all the food that he can on credit from the restaurant, running it in the front door with no intention of ever paying it back, and then running it out the back door and selling it for 20 cents on the dollar. And everybody understands that part of the fraud. And that's step 4 of the fraud, the creating the liquidity event. But it's what happens next in this movie that I think is caught, that I don't think is truly appreciated. And that is the next thing that the mobsters do is they burn the restaurant to the ground. And what that does is that stops people from asking who stole from the restaurant.
Where's the food? Where's the booze?
To who burnt the restaurant down. And in financial crimes, you see that everywhere.
And it leaves them nothing to chase, nothing to go after.
Which, when you got a transaction that can jump borders, but laws can't, and then by the time you do catch up with them and they burn the restaurant to the ground, it makes it even harder to get your hands around the financial fraud.
Let me ask you a question. You have led the way in terms of, and I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but there is a strategy called a private RICO against some of these financial institutions. Maybe you don't want to talk about it too much, but what can you say about where that what led you to that as a remedy? And what do you think of it having gone to this point? Just say a little bit about this innovation.
Well, yeah, we can touch on it a little bit. Imagine how I said earlier, we were on the super highway of fraud.
And imagine you have all the documents proving the fraud beyond a shadow of a doubt. And you go to the police and you go, "Look at this. Look what they've done to me. Look how they've robbed me." And the police go, "Wow, you're right. That's really complicated. That would be hard to get for a jury to get their head around. You should sue them."
Rather than having.
So then you go to the FBI and they say the same thing. You go to the Secret Service, you go to the IRS, and they go, "Yeah, wow, that's an amazingly well-documented fraud. You should sue them." The problem with taking a criminal case to a civil court is a civil court is not equipped to adjudicate a criminal matter. And so you end up in this vortex of bad judgments and judges that want to cut the baby in half. They want to give each side a little bit of a win, and you never get any real justice. But then, you're left with things like RICO.
So imagine you're on that super highway of fraud, and the police decide to not enforce the speed limits. And that's essentially where we are in the banking system, is that, as I mentioned earlier, they're just not enforcing the law. And what that's doing is putting a lot of pressure on the civil system. And so Tanya and I 2 years ago decided that we needed to attack this in a completely different way.
We tried everything else for more than a decade.
And we assembled a global team of lawyers and accountants that weren't corrupt. And we
Harder
started
to do than you'd think.
harder to do than you would think. And we assembled a team that's basically spent the last 2 years putting together a civil claim against some banks and accountants that I think will change kind of the perception of how you can pursue these issues cross-border. And so we're kind of on the cutting edge of that. And I'd like to tell you a lot more of that, but the people that we're working with probably hang me by my thumbs
Yeah, our lawyers would.
on it. But
I appreciate your sharing us even that amount. I've been desperate, as many of us are on this call, to find new ways, given the incapacities of government agencies in this area, the balkanization of enforcement, the bureaucratics, the foot dragging, and that's before you even get to the influence peddling, and the all that kind of stuff. But I mean, what keeps you going?
what keeps me going? What a great question. Depends on the day, Jim. A lot of it is just I don't like losing. We don't like losing out of it, and we can see the damage that it's doing to the society. The people that spoke before, John and Khadija and Andreas, I couldn't agree more with everything that they've said and the actions that they're taking. Getting this thing coordinated and making sure that the information is being shared, much like a forum like this, is absolutely mission critical. And we are in uncharted territory. But at the end of the day, what it really amounts to is that we're in uncharted territory as far as capitalism goes, and we're kind of in uncharted territory as far as the democracy goes. And both of them, we're on a learning curve.
But at the end of the day, I think that it all boils down to crime and then punishment. Unless you have true punishment, you don't have a deterrent. And the fact that banks and accountant firms, the professional facilitators, have boiled into their equation, a recipe for how much in fines they're willing to pay because they're making so much money doing the crime. We have to go backwards and stop the cooperation and actually, if the heads of the banks are doing jail time, it's going to change their risk reward perception.
I think to answer your question specifically, we've had to go back and look at the banks as if they were mobsters, which you'd mentioned the RICO statute, the civil RICO statute that we're using.
They're criminal.
And really is. It's a criminal conspiracy. And there are laws out there that exist to do battle with. We just hope that the judges will uphold them the way that they should. That'll be the next big battle.
Right.
And I compress that down because I know we're really tight for time. So
yeah.
No, I think that you've got a lot more to add. We're having another session next week. We might have you join in just as the commentators on Stephen Donziger is coming here, and also Victor Yannick on environmental law on the 19th. So there may be opportunities to continue this conversation. I just want to make the point that one of the problems we see in the enforcement against the big banks, and I've looked closely at the top 22 banks over the last 20 years, is just the time lags. So all of the rewards from criminal activity at big banks comes up front. And then if they get caught and prosecuted and everything down the road, you can show a nice cash flow diagram, which shows that it's a very profitable activity, even if they get caught and have to pay fines. After the 8 to 10 years it takes to prosecute these banks. So, well, that's an outstanding perspective, and thank you so much. We are running out of time. David is here. I'm going to turn to him for a few remarks now on some of the issues that we've identified, but I don't think we can do justice to the fintech aspects of this. If we want to, sort of continue this, or what, how do you want us over? Well, the class is formally over. How do people feel about staying a few more minutes? What? Can? Yes, okay. Good. Everybody wants to stay.
Sure.
So please indulge us. This is an exciting class. We're going to share my screen. Okay. That works. So, hey, everybody. Tanya and Darren, thank you so much for that. It was really just a tea tasting.
So, yeah, David Lighton here. I'm going to present a slightly different perspective, I think, without probably contradicting anyone else here. But I've been operating in the global development and financial services industry for over 10 years at this point. I started my career in the World Bank Group, where I was working on Haiti after the earthquake. I have been pretty interested in remittances since then, but I'm also the founder of a fintech company called Diameter Pay. We have been the beneficiary of some R&D money from the European Commission. So I've got a team of about 15 guys building technology for cross-border payments. And so we're deep in the thick of these discussions about global offshore in some sense, but really more so in the discussions about payments to the developing world. So what I thought I would do is give just a little bit of high-level history to bring another perspective and some context of what's going on in the world right now. And I hope that this may be an interesting addition to all the other great presentations today. So what I wanted to start with was basically that we are living in an era of major difficulty with financial crime enforcement. And what I guess I would want to say is that to me it's not totally obvious why financial crime and cross-border payments are necessarily connected, right? I think you get into a lot of really difficult questions about whether people in poor countries are necessarily doing bad things when you start asking those questions, right? So we've been talking about the havens, which is fine. I'd like to talk for a minute about the developing world and show you guys something interesting. But before we get into that, a little bit of history. So, John mentioned that since the Panama Papers were published, there's been enormous scrutiny on offshore jurisdictions. And I think that's true. There's been FATCA and new tax legislation. You can't violate the home jurisdiction's tax laws. So if you're an American parking money in another country, you still have to comply with the US tax laws, at least in theory. I can't really opine on what the enforcement is like. But what I can say I'm trying to do with my own business is to address some of the issues with de-risking. And so de-risking is kind of the other side of this coin. So living in a world with more stringent enforcement of anti-money laundering and tax policies, what we've seen is that a lot of the US banks don't want to do business in the developing world anymore at all. And their basic case for that is to say, hey, listen, I've got a very complex environment out there. I've got the USA Patriot Act in 2002, sanctions from the Financial Action Task Force, the global financial crisis, which increased capital requirements for banks that may want to do international activities and tie up parts of their balance sheet somewhere else. Panama Papers, of course. And then in both the Trump and Biden administrations, seriously increasing complexity in the sanctions environment. So for example, if you're a US bank trying to service a Chinese company, all of a sudden you have a much higher risk that you're going to do something illegal without intending to. So one of the other presenters was talking about, running sanctions against shell companies, right? And this is a serious problem because if you're dealing with a payment that has to do with a sanctioned entity, that's against the law. Whether handling a payment for a shell company that is actually, that has a sanctioned entity behind it is also a big risk. Because if you end up in an investigation with OFAC, which is the sanctions enforcement agency, you're probably going to get a big fine or at least have a major disruption to your business. So these are some of the facts that inform today's environment. And I think I would just add that it's only gotten much more complicated since the Russia-Ukraine war. But this BIS data, which is pretty stale, it's from 2019, shows a trend of the US banks just choosing to do business much less often in the developing world. So what I'd like to do is show you a little data. I like the Brazil example. Well, let's start with a little ode to our friends talking about the havens. So here's Ireland. In the 8 years between 2011 and 2019, actually more banks chose to service Ireland. So more US and European banks chose to do business with Irish banks. But if you look at the value of their payments, it's increased 530%. So those are the proceeds of multinationals parking money in Ireland. So that's coming up in the data. So Ireland is a beneficiary of this like new global tax regime that we've been talking about a little bit today. So I'm going to give a nod to that. Now I want to look at the developing world. So you got Brazil, who has experienced a 30% decline roughly in the number of banks that want to service Brazil in the US. So what it means is that there are, if you're a Brazilian bank that wants to do business in US dollars, not in the local currency, and of course, if you're doing anything cross-border, most of the people want to get paid in dollars. If you're doing FX conversions, that's very expensive. Vast majority of global trade stuff is same currency. So for example, if you're buying aluminum in a foreign country, you're probably going to get paid for it in dollars. You're probably going to pay in dollars on both sides. If you're doing something sophisticated, it's rare that you would do FX and convert the currency. So in the span of this 8 years, while Brazil's correspondent banks has declined by 28%, the value of their cross-border activity has increased by 77%. So it's almost doubled. So what I wanted to say just briefly is that this problem is extremely complex. So talking about financial crime is just sort of scratching the surface of the complexity in the global trading environment. We don't really have time to talk about sanctions in depth, but I think this says a lot, which is that one of the effects of increased attention on anti-money laundering and financial crimes is a kind of, center periphery dynamic emerging that's very stark, where we see the beginning of a kind of deglobalization that people are talking a lot about nowadays. And what I would leave you guys with, because I know we don't have a ton of time, and we can talk about fintech more if you want, is that all these questions are very central when we start talking about whether the dollar dominance is really going to remain forever. Personally, I think that it will for a long time, but these sorts of statistics show you that there's pressure on the dollar dominance. So we could look at a couple of other ones. Here's an example, Algeria, where the number of correspondent banks has declined and they've actually traded less. So in Brazil, you have a really fast growing economy, but in Algeria, you've got banks de-risking, leaving the region. And now as a result, presumably Algeria is actually trading less with the rest of the world. So this is like pretty important to pay attention to. So
look at Argentina.
Let's look at Argentina. So Argentina's trade increased by Argentina's trade more than doubled. And the number of servicers declined by almost 40%.
So this is telling me that the activity of servicing Argentina and Brazil is becoming more concentrated. It isn't declining. In Algeria, it's declining, but the actual value of payments and the size of the payments per payment is increasing in both. The ratio of
that's correct. What this data set doesn't say anything about is cost. The costs are going up, especially for small banks and especially for smaller firms that are involved in international trade. So this is another, sort of a subtopic related to our discussion today on financial crime, but I just wanted to make this point that it's a complex topic.
Yeah. It is. But if you talk about trade finance, this is not
this isn't trade finance though. This is just payments.
So payments activities by banks. You're suggesting that the activity is becoming more concentrated among a handful of banks.
More concentrated among a handful of banks, and the smaller banks are not able to access the U.S. and Europe increasingly.
Right.
So and one other thing to add is that the banks that are able might actually be local charters of US banks or European banks. So the dominant bank in Senegal, for example, is still BNP Paribas.
Take a look at South Africa. There you really do have a shrinkage.
You have a shrinkage. So people don't want this basically tells you people don't want to do business with South Africa. Because the value of their trade.
Myanmar.
So Myanmar was growing a lot. This is before the government fell, but this is a good one. So people invested.
Wow.
There were
That's incredible.
banks that wanted to do business in Myanmar during this time.
This is under Aung San Suu Kyi.
That's exactly right. So this data set ended in 2019.
People are gonna drift away here, but this is terrific, and we need to have you, somehow we have to have another whole session on this topic. I mean, there are a lot of issues that we didn't get into here.
And 2 students or so, if you want to come for dinner, you can, or even more. Such a small.
How do people feel about this session? Good. Hope we can maintain quality in the.
Let's say more.
Same way. Yeah, but I mean, we always want to leave you a little bit hungry, right, in the meal, so that's a definition of victory for us. I want to thank everyone here. It's late in Europe. Of course, it's always late in Europe, but it's not late in Austin. But thank you so much.